What if the beginning we were given is not the true beginning, but merely the start of a chapter arbitrarily designated as the whole book? There is a quiet, persistent dissonance that echoes beneath the accepted archaeological narrative, a feeling that the very foundations of human civilization, those structures we attribute to the rise of Sumer, are resting upon an older, far more massive pedestal that has been meticulously swept from the historical record. This isn't about denying the profound sophistication of the Sumerians. It is about recognizing that their brilliance might not have been a spontaneous combustion of genius, but rather a dedicated, almost reverential inheritance. Our understanding of structured society, writing law, and complex astronomy traces an undeniable lineage back to the Mesopotamian floodplains, specifically to the first inscribed clay tablets. These ancient fragments, etched with the pointed stylus in the archaic script of cuneiform, present us with the Genesis story of our current epoch. They speak of the arrival of beings, often identified as the Anunnaki, who descended from the heavens to impart knowledge, establish order, and assist in the reconstruction of a shattered world. This narrative, the interventionist Genesis, has become the cornerstone of countless theories and explorations into our past, yet the deep reading of these very texts reveals troubling chronological seams, moments where the narrative stutters, implying a history so vast that even the arrival of the Anunnaki was itself a re-establishment of order, not its initial creation. We accept the story of the Anunnaki as the primary catalyst. They taught humanity how to farm, how to build cities like Eridu, and how to govern complex social structures. But if we allow ourselves a momentary suspension of that belief and look at the texts not as sacred dogma, but as an archived record of witnesses, an unsettling question arises. What were the Anunnaki observing when they arrived? What pre-existing framework allowed for the almost immediate explosive sophistication seen in Sumer? To believe that supreme, technologically advanced beings arrived on a desolate, primitive Earth and instantly created the entire organizational blueprint strains. Credulity. It is far more intellectually honest to consider the possibility that they arrived to a planet already bearing the indelible marks of previous habitation, previous knowledge, and previous disaster. This inquietude intensifies when we turn to the most challenging documents in the Sumerian repository, the king lists. These lists, seemingly simple chronicles of rulers and their domains, are anything but simple. They delineate two distinct eras of rulership, separated by the terrifying, comprehensive violence of the deluge. The post-flood kings reign for historically understandable periods, decades, sometimes a century. But the pre-Diluvian kings, the rulers who held the scepter before the waters came, boast astronomical reigns. Figures like 28,800 years, 36,000 years, even 43,200 years for a single ruler. This is not mythology designed to impress. These are meticulous records designed to transmit a terrifying weight of time. The sheer, overwhelming duration assigned to this initial era of kingship suggests that the timeline we currently use for history is a fraction of the full story. It suggests a civilization so distant, so profound in its lifespan, that the figures we read might represent generational dynasties, or perhaps even a temporal measurement system that fundamentally operated outside the current constraints of human perception. The flood, in this context, was not merely a cataclysm. It was a devastating chronological reset, erasing not just the physical structures of that former world, but fracturing the very memory of it, leaving only these impossibly long numbers as silent, staring evidence. This is where the true investigation must begin, not by seeking confirmation of the Anunnaki's existence, but by seeking the evidence of their teachers, or perhaps their predecessors. If the Anunnaki brought the blueprint for civilization, where did they find that blueprint? It is a philosophical loop that demands resolution. Civilizations do not simply materialize fully formed, even those guided by beings from the stars. There is always a preceding stage of observation, refinement, and knowledge acquisition. The Sumerians themselves were careful record keepers, often distinguishing between the divine instruction and the old knowledge. If we focus on this older knowledge, we begin to feel the strange, cold touch of something deeply archaic. We must pause and consider this profound chronological inertia, the weight of epochs mentioned casually in clay. If this resonance, this unsettling feeling that we have missed the true beginning, is powerful for you, perhaps share your thoughts below, even if it is just a single word like inheritance or echoes. Engaging with this material deeply is crucial, and if you find yourself captivated by this descent into the prehistory, I invite you to join this exploration fully by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your attention is the only catalyst that keeps these forgotten histories alive. Continuing our journey, we find that the texts repeatedly reference settlements and concepts that defy the established timeline of Sumerian archaeology. Eridu is universally celebrated as the first city established by the gods, following the descent of kingship, the cradle of civilization, in the official record. Yet, scattered textual fragments and geographical references suggest a structure, a system of organization, or even a precursor city existing in the silent millennia immediately preceding Eridu's supposed foundation. Think of the concept of the Apsu, the deep, primordial freshwater abyss, and the complex associated with Enki. Was Eridu merely the most prominent city in the new cycle, built strategically on the ruins or the energy node of an older, submerged capital? The descriptions of the infrastructure and specialized knowledge required by the pre-flood rulers, knowledge of hydroengineering, sophisticated metallurgy, and celestial mechanics, imply a high-functioning society that did not need to be taught basic concepts like the arch or the wheel by the arriving celestial beings. They already possessed them. The arrival was perhaps a technological transfer, yes, but also a simple continuity. The truth, encoded in the most profound myths of the ancient world, is that history is not linear, but cyclical. The Sumerian, Babylonian, and later Greek texts speak of great years, epochs measured not in simple decades, but in vast cosmological alignments. The concept of the return, the apokatastasis, is embedded in the structure of their astronomy. They understood that civilizations rise, reach an apex, and inevitably fall, only to be succeeded by another, often utilizing the preserved remnants or the stored knowledge of the last. The Great Flood, the Deluge, was merely one such punctuation mark, the inevitable result of a cycle reaching its violent conclusion. This perspective shifts the question entirely. We are not asking if a civilization existed before the Anunnaki, but rather when and why its memory was deliberately suppressed or simply lost due to the devastating magnitude of the planetary reset. This brings us to the concept of the silent witnesses, the beings, or perhaps the mechanisms, that observed the previous cycle without necessarily participating in its demise. The Anunnaki arrived. They were the administrators of the new order. But the subtle references in the most esoteric tablets suggest that their task was not to create from nothing, but to retrieve and reorganize the debris of a hyper-advanced, self-sustaining society that had collapsed. We must consider the possibility that the Anunnaki themselves were heirs to this previous culture, tasked with preserving its essence until the planet stabilized sufficiently for reseeding. Their legendary longevity, their mastery of systems, might not have been inherently divine, but rather the result of inheriting the technology and genetic longevity engineered by the civilization that preceded them. The final essential question of this initial investigation is the one that sets the stage for everything that follows. If the Anunnaki, known to us as the master builders and teachers, were merely the custodians of knowledge, the observers who stepped in after the great catastrophe, then who were the initial architects? Who were the engineers of those impossible structures, the masters of the pre-Diluvian cycles that ruled for tens of thousands of years? We are faced with the evidence of immense time, sophisticated organization, and technological capability, all of which predate the official historical entry point of the Anunnaki arrival. The Sumerian tablets, in their silent refusal to align with a simple linear chronology, are whispering a truth that forces us to look beyond the accepted myth of creation and towards a far older, far more mysterious civilization buried deep beneath the silt and the collective amnesia of the deluge. It is a quest to find the true source code of human civilization, a civilization that was not just powerful, but ancient, beyond our most liberal estimations. If this descent into the archaic memory has captured your attention, if you feel the pull of this profound hidden history, it is because you recognize the signal of something forgotten, something essential to understanding who we are now. If you have stayed until this moment, you are part of the small community dedicated to retrieving this lost knowledge. Please show your support by subscribing to the channel and liking this video, and share your most potent realization in the comments by simply writing the phrase, "Before the descent." We must continue to follow these chronological shadows, brick by broken brick, as we move now to examine the geographical and archaeological evidence for the physical remnants of this civilization that existed before the Anunnaki took their seat on the throne of history. The journey continues in the next part. Did the beginning we have been taught truly mark the first step? Or was it merely the earliest acceptable point of reference, a deliberate truncation of a timeline too vast and unsettling for the collective memory to bear? This is the unsettling question that begins to form when we truly dedicate ourselves to the meticulous, sometimes maddening study of the Sumerian clay tablets. The traditional narrative, cemented in popular culture and often in certain fringe theories, holds that the Anunnaki arrived, whether as gods, progenitors, or highly advanced extraterrestrials, and initiated civilization. They taught, they built, they engineered, perhaps even created humanity as we know it. But the deeper we dig into the stratigraphy of the cuneiform itself, the less stable that foundation appears. We are not just looking at gaps in the record. We are looking at deliberate omissions, negative space where colossal chapters of history should reside, marked only by the spectral echoes of what was displaced. The profound intellectual estrangement begins when we confront the Sumerian king list. This document, vital for establishing the chronology of early Mesopotamia, names kings and cities stretching back far into the deep past, preceding the Great Flood, known in the texts as the Wana. While the impossibly long reigns of these early rulers, tens of thousands of years, are typically dismissed as mythological exaggeration, they serve a powerful, non-mythological function. They establish the principle of continuity, stretching back to an immeasurable horizon. But what precedes the list itself? The phrase that acts as the great hinge of history, defining the two epochs, is this: "After the flood, kingship again descended from heaven." This phrase confirms the renewal of the divine or advanced system brought by the Anunnaki post-cataclysm. Yet, the first section of the list clearly states that kingship first descended from heaven before the flood, defining the original antediluvian epoch. If the Anunnaki were the source of the second descent, who or what catalyzed the first? Who were the sovereigns before the sovereigns? We are staring into the chasm of the pre-deluge silence, a period not empty of life, but seemingly empty of recognized, acknowledged progenitors. This silence is not a void. It is a curtain drawn across a highly active stage. We find unsettling clues in texts that describe the construction of the earliest known cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Cities whose foundations are sometimes attributed to specific Anunnaki figures, but whose initial blueprints seem to reference an architectural geometry that predates the arrival of the known pantheon. Imagine studying a colossal piece of machinery and realizing that the foundational gears, the truly complex inner workings, were created by a manufacturer whose name is intentionally omitted from the modern product label. The Anunnaki, perhaps, were merely the inheritors, the caretakers, or even the dismantlers of an even grander system. They brought order to a chaotic post-flood world, certainly, but the elements of that order, the mathematics, the astronomical knowledge, the agricultural proficiency, feel less like invention and more like a recovery operation, the salvage of a vastly superior knowledge base left behind. This is the weight of unread clay, the physical manifestation of tablets that carry the linguistic strain of trying to explain a concept, a civilization that the scribes knew existed but were perhaps forbidden or intellectually incapable of fully defining within the new framework. To truly understand this deeper history, we must allow ourselves to be guided not by conventional history, but by the emotional resonance of the documents. If this journey into the ancient mind resonates with a strange, deep truth within you, if you feel the same intellectual pull toward the obscured timeline, perhaps it is worth reflecting on why this particular historical question evokes such an intense, almost primal curiosity. This investigation requires collective focus and attention to detail. If you find value in dismantling the accepted timelines and exploring these profound historical mysteries, consider sharing your thoughts on this idea of a pre-deluge silence in the comments below. Your input helps chart the course for this extended journey of discovery. And if you have yet to subscribe, know that you are part of a community dedicated to uncovering the layers beneath the official story, a journey that demands sustained engagement. The evidence for this preceding civilization often appears through the lens of the ghostly record keepers, figures mentioned briefly outside the main pantheon, often referred to as watchers or elders who existed in the time when the earth was not yet fully stabilized. These are not the familiar Igigi or Anunnaki. They are older, their purpose seemingly related to observation rather than direct intervention or governance. Their existence introduces the crucial concept of cycles, not linearity. Western thought tends to view history as a straight line, always progressing forward. Sumerian cosmology, however, and indeed many ancient systems, viewed time as cyclical, a recurring pattern of destruction and renewal, ascent and collapse. If history moves in cycles, then the Anunnaki arrival was not an absolute beginning, but a turning point within a much larger, recurring orbit. What if the civilization before them represented the peak of the previous cycle? Their knowledge might have been so pure, so advanced, that it transcended the need for the physical manifestation of technology, a conceptual mastery that made the later Anunnaki technology seem clumsy and necessary only for a species beginning anew. This realization brings us to the metaphorical sign of the reversed helix. If we view cultural and perhaps even genetic inheritance as a helix, the known Sumerian civilization represents one winding of that strand. But the evidence of the earlier civilization suggests an inversion, a prior code that was inherently simpler, more robust, and less prone to decay. The Anunnaki system, while complex and brilliant, contained the seeds of its own eventual collapse, tied to hierarchy and resources. The preceding system hinted at in the earliest fragments suggests a knowledge base tied directly to the fundamental nature of the cosmos, a language of pure intent, where understanding the universe was intuitive rather than mathematically modeled. Imagine a civilization that understood the relationship between matter and energy, not through massive particle accelerators, but through a unified consciousness, a possibility that feels inherently more ancient, more profound, and harder to leave traces of in the clay. When the Anunnaki descended, whether post-flood or in the initial earlier phase, they assumed the role of the observers and the veil. They became the new architects, but their primary function may not have been just teaching, but also managing the residual memory of the previous age. The veil is the layer of mythology and ritual they imposed, which, while giving structure to the new human experience, simultaneously obscured the source. Every foundational myth contains a necessary lie of origin, a simplification that allows the new society to function without the existential burden of realizing they are living in the ruins of a forgotten, superior achievement. The Anunnaki needed humanity to focus on the immediate, the tangible, gold, agriculture, service, not on the philosophical implications of a vanished golden age. This intellectual confrontation leads to a shudder in the foundations, the uneasy recognition that our entire historical framework might be a deliberate truncation. If the Sumerian king list is not myth, but a corrupted record of immense time periods, then the story of humanity is far older and far more complex than we dare to imagine. We must ask, why erase the memory of the predecessors? Was it rivalry? Was it necessity? Or was the knowledge of the before civilization simply incompatible with the new paradigm being established? The sheer duration of the reigns of those pre-flood kings, the hundreds of thousands of years, acts as a silent, terrifying alarm bell, signaling an epoch that defies our current understanding of evolution, technological progress, and societal stability. This duration suggests not hyperbole, but an entirely different mode of existence, perhaps even a different relationship to time itself. If you find yourself intellectually grappling with the weight of this possible amnesia, consider commenting with the phrase, "the echo of zero." Let us gauge the collective recognition of this profound historical unsettling. The whispers in the cuneiform tablets suggest that the true historical trauma was not the flood itself, but the deliberate act of forgetting what the flood merely cleansed. The Anunnaki narrative gave us a clear, digestible beginning, but that clarity comes at the cost of infinite depth. We are being asked to believe that sophisticated systems of accounting, cosmology, and governance simply sprang into being with the arrival of the gods. But what if they were simply the curators, not the creators? What if they were the ones who found the scattered components of the original masterpiece and, in their efforts to rebuild, inadvertently covered the trail back to the true artist? This subtle shift in perspective transforms the entire Sumerian record from a story of divine arrival into a meticulous instruction manual left behind by a temporary custodian. This trajectory points us toward the inevitable return of the source. The enduring power of these ancient texts lies in their persistent refusal to let the past remain buried. They contain residual data points, ghost signals, pointing toward the physical and metaphysical locations of this original civilization. If we are to move forward in our investigation, we must now pivot from interpreting the texts to seeking the physical evidence that corroborates this profound historical displacement. Where did these elders live? What monuments, resistant to the flood and the subsequent erasure, might still exist? The clay has told us that the previous civilization existed. The earth must now tell us where and how. The next phase of this deep investigation requires us to trace these ghostly trails to the literal bedrock of Mesopotamia, searching for structures, compounds, or perhaps anomalies that predate the very first acknowledged city. If you have stayed with us through this deep dive into the unsettling realization of a history truncated, it means you possess the curiosity and intellectual fortitude required to truly see the complexities hidden within the ancient world. This journey is far from over. If you feel compelled by the weight of these historical possibilities, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video, enabling us to continue this meticulous, demanding research. Share your reflection below. the echo of zero. And when you are ready to confront the physical implications of this discovery, join us in the next chapter where we begin to trace the literal footsteps of the civilization that predates the Anunnaki. What if the most profound evidence of forgotten history is not found in what is explicitly stated, but in the silence between the lines, the temporal pauses that our modern historical methods refuse to acknowledge? We look at the Sumerian king list, for instance, and see reigns stretching across impossible spans of time, thousands of years for a single king, or perhaps for a single ruling dynasty. Our intellect immediately attempts to rationalize this anomaly, labeling it myth or poetic exaggeration, a way for a nascent civilization to confer ancient authority upon its rulers. Yet, what if that rationalization is merely an intellectual defense mechanism protecting us from the profound strangeness of the observation itself? We assume linear time, human lifespans, and standard administrative cycles. But the Sumerians, the very people who gifted us the concept of measured time in 60-second and 60-minute increments, recorded a different history, one where the boundaries of temporality were dramatically stretched before they were suddenly, violently compressed. The discomfort arises when we place this chronological aberration alongside the most sophisticated of their surviving concepts, the me. These were not mere rules or laws delivered by the Anunnaki after their arrival. The me were understood as the divine pre-existing templates for civilization itself, a comprehensive, immutable list of 70 or more essential concepts covering everything from kingship and ritual to metallurgy and prostitution. If the Anunnaki arrived to bring order to chaos and to teach humanity the basic frameworks of civilization, why were these essential templates, these me, already existing in a conceptual domain, waiting to be retrieved or perhaps merely re-established? This suggests that the structure of civilization, its very operating system, predated the widely accepted intervention of the sky beings. The Anunnaki, according to this subterranean narrative woven deep into the clay, did not invent the system. They either merely implemented a forgotten one, or perhaps inherited the keys from a previous, silent custodian. This is the first echo of a civilization before the recognized Genesis. It's a whisper that implies order existed long before the supposed chaotic void from which the Anunnaki drew us. It forces us to ask, who wrote the original blueprint, and why was their memory so thoroughly erased from the surface narrative, surviving only in these abstract foundational pillars? The sheer density of the knowledge found immediately upon the supposed start of Sumerian civilization, their advanced mathematics, their perfect alignment with sophisticated astronomical data, their command of hydrology, presents a further paradox. We are asked to believe that the Anunnaki arrived, taught them writing and organization, and almost immediately, within a historical blink of an eye, the Sumerians were calculating stellar precession cycles and solving complex quadratic equations. This kind of sudden technological and mathematical leap defies every known pattern of human development and cultural evolution. It is not an organic growth. It looks like a direct, complex injection of a fully formed knowledge base. But if it was an injection, why are there Sumerian texts that seem to describe the source of that knowledge existing in a time period entirely separate from and chronologically antecedent to the arrival of the great sky travelers? It is as though we stumbled upon an ancient computer, pristine in its function, but whose user manual contains several blank pages where the initial startup sequence should have been. The silence before the signal is deafening. If the texts themselves speak of a time before the flood, a period when the divine scepter descended from heaven to the city of Eridu, establishing the very first kingship, we must focus not on the flood itself, but on the strange longevity of the pre-flood rulers. These rulers, designated by the king list, governed for periods so immense they seem to belong to a different phase of reality. 5 successive cities held this kingship before the Great Deluge, and the total duration of their rule spans hundreds of thousands of years. We can dismiss this as fiction, certainly, but in doing so, we ignore the cultural persistence that required this timeline to be recorded and preserved on baked clay tablets. It suggests a profound recognition of a history that transcends human memory, maintained not as mythology, but as the official recorded chronology of state. This is the recognition point. The Sumerians weren't just recording their present, they were custodians of a lineage that stretched beyond our comprehension. A lineage that begins not with the Anunnaki, but with something far older and less definable. This brings us to the profound unease of the clay paradox. If the Anunnaki are credited with teaching humanity how to scratch symbols onto clay, the gift of writing, then how do we possess writings that detail the structure, the timelines, and the foundational wisdom of the civilization that existed before their supposed arrival? For these records to exist, there must have been a previous system of literacy, a form of recording and transmission that operated entirely outside the framework given by the intervening entities. This previous civilization must have possessed the means to store and retrieve data, perhaps on materials that did not survive the Great Catastrophe, or perhaps in a codified form of memory that was later transcribed onto the more durable clay once the Anunnaki system was established. This implies an intellectual inheritance, not an origin. The Anunnaki, in this light, become the restorers of a fractured library, the inheritors of a damaged legacy, rather than the original authors of human civilization. The question then shifts from what did the Anunnaki teach us to the far more unsettling query, what information did they find here and what did they choose to pass on to the subsequent generations? If this quiet, almost psychological recognition of an inherited silence resonates with the echo you feel in history, pause and consider adding your own perspective below. Do these temporal paradoxes feel like errors in translation, or are they intentional gaps left by a history we are only just beginning to recover? If this inquiry into the deep past, into the layers of truth buried beneath the surface narratives, aligns with your own search for understanding, please consider joining this community of shared exploration by liking this video and subscribing. Your engagement helps us continue this crucial investigation into the forgotten chronologies of our world. The deep dive into Eridu, often called the First City, offers further gradual revelation. While Sumerian tradition credits the Anunnaki with establishing Eridu as the first post-Diluvian center, archaeological excavations peel back layers of time, revealing structures beneath the earliest known Sumerian temples. Beneath the foundations associated with the recognized deity Enki, we find traces of older, simpler, yet distinctly non-primitive settlement patterns. These earliest strata, the Ur-Eridu, speak to a continuous occupation, a foundational memory that links the known civilization directly back into the misty pre-flood epoch. These are the physical anchors of the before, a stubborn continuity that suggests that civilization wasn't simply restarted from scratch. It was reoccupied and repurposed. And who were the stewards of this continuity? The texts consistently refer to the Apkallu, the 7 sages, who came from the sea before the flood. These figures are often depicted as part man, part fish, or wearing strange protective suits. They are characterized as advisors to the first kings, bringing profound knowledge and morality. If the Anunnaki arrived to teach us, why do these pre-flood, pre-Anunnaki figures hold the authority of primary teachers and moral custodians? They are the remnants, the observers, perhaps the last surviving personnel of the civilization that preceded the catastrophe. They are the living memory, the quiet librarians who ensured that the core concepts, the me, were preserved, waiting for the arrival of the next great organizers. They stand as silent testimony to a structured society that did not collapse into barbarism, but was simply swept away by water, leaving its intellectual custodians behind to seed the next era. This realization compels us to reconsider the Sumerian understanding of time itself. Their obsession with astronomical cycles, particularly the concept of the Great Year, the 26,000-year cycle of precession, seems disproportionate to the needs of an agrarian society focused on the immediate flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates. Why record the slow tilt of the Earth's axis unless this knowledge was integral to understanding the rhythm of civilization itself? This sophisticated cosmological framework suggests that their primary concern was not linear progress, but the inevitability of cycles, the rise, peak, destruction, and return. If the first civilization possessed this knowledge of celestial mechanics, it implies they understood the periodicity of catastrophe. They knew the timeline for the Great Reset. This inherited knowledge of cycles would explain the persistent, underlying anxiety in the Sumerian psyche, the constant fear of the return, not just of the gods, but of the conditions that triggered the previous collapse. The Anunnaki, in this sense, become the guardians of the current epoch, tasked with maintaining order until the next cycle concludes. This leads us to the critical distinction of inherited knowledge. When we examine the foundational infrastructure of Sumer, the layout of the great temples, the highly standardized measurement systems, the incredibly advanced metallurgy, we are often crediting the Anunnaki with these innovations. But what if they were simply utilizing the established protocols and technologies left behind? Consider the famous episode where Inanna steals the me from Enki. This narrative is not about creation, it is about transfer and possession. The knowledge is treated as a finite existing resource, a physical inheritance to be guarded or stolen, not a creative intellectual breakthrough of the gods themselves. This strengthens the case that the Anunnaki inherited, codified, and utilized the framework of a previous silent civilization. The existential dread encoded in the deepest Sumerian lamentations speaks not just of divine abandonment, but of the primordial void, the terrifying state of being before the waters were separated and before the me were organized. This fear is the shadow of the forgotten civilization, the memory of the collapse that led to pure, unorganized chaos. It is the fear of returning to the state before the signal of organized life was broadcast. And it is this very fear that necessitated the meticulous recording of the pre-Anunnaki chronology, ensuring that the memory of what was lost would not fade entirely. But the history is not just a warning. It might be a deliberate instruction. If the previous civilization understood the cyclical nature of destruction and rebirth, it is highly probable they would have left behind a deliberately encoded signal, a means of retrieval for future inheritors. Perhaps the king lists astronomical periods or the mathematical constants found in the ziggurats are not errors, but placeholders, markers designed to survive the cataclysm and be recognized by those with the technological ability to decode them during the next stable epoch. This signal would be the ultimate act of intellectual legacy, a silent whisper across millennia, waiting for the right moment of cosmological alignment to be heard again. The ongoing investigation of the Sumerian texts, stripping away the layers of theological interpretation to expose the raw data of chronology and cosmology, brings us closer to hearing that whisper. We are not just uncovering ancient history, we are participating in a massive, slow-motion data recovery project initiated by a civilization that knew it was doomed but refused to be entirely erased. If you have stayed with us through this deep reflection, if this conversation about the deep structure of time resonates with your core sense of curiosity, then you are part of the select few who truly understand the gravity of this discovery. We encourage you to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications, ensuring you receive the next crucial part of this investigation as soon as it is released. Please take a moment to hit the like button and share your most profound insight by commenting this precise phrase, the inherited silence. Join us next time as we begin to decode the very nature of that signal, turning our focus toward the architectural and astronomical anomalies that seem to have been deliberately preserved to guide the inheritors of the Sumerian legacy. Until then, keep observing the shadows of history. What if the most profound discoveries about our past are hidden not in what the ancient texts explicitly state, but in the echoes of what they deliberately omit? This is the uneasy intellectual terrain we must navigate when we confront the earliest strata da escrita Sumeria. We have focused extensively on the narratives that detail the arrival and supervision of the Anunnaki, the celestial figures who are said to have brought order, technology, and governance to Mesopotamia. Yet the deeper we read, the clearer it becomes that these texts function less as a record of origin and more as a historical management document, a ledger detailing the transfer of power rather than its initial establishment. It is the language around the gods, the references embedded within the cultural substrata of Sumer itself, that begins to whisper the secret of an era that predates even the mythology of divine descent. Consider the unsettling paradox of the Sumerian emergence. Civilization, by all traditional archaeological metrics, is a laborious, incremental process. It involves the slow evolution of agriculture, the gradual invention of writing, the hesitant transition from village to city-state. Sumer, however, appears in the historical record, around the 4th millennium BCE, as essentially complete. They possessed complex irrigation systems, monumental architecture, advanced mathematics, a fully formed legal code, and the most sophisticated writing system of their time, cuneiform, which sprung forth with remarkable suddenness, not as a hesitant pictographic babble, but as a system already capable of recording complex administrative and literary thought. Where are the centuries of trial and error? Where is the awkward infancy of this unparalleled culture? Scholars typically attribute this leap to a genius surge, an unparalleled collective inspiration. But what if that genius surge was, in fact, the calculated activation of a heritage already stored? What if they were merely retrieving a library rather than writing the first chapter? The greatest evidence for a civilization before the Anunnaki may reside in the linguistic anomaly of the Sumerian language itself. Sumerian is what linguists call an isolate. It has no discernible linguistic relatives. It does not fit into the Afro-Asiatic or Indo-European families that dominate the region. It is a linguistic orphan, a sophisticated system dropped seemingly out of nowhere into the Fertile Crescent. This extreme isolation suggests that the people who spoke it arrived from somewhere else, or more provocatively, that they were the inheritors of a knowledge system from a time so distant that all connecting linguistic bridges were swallowed by deep time. But even within the Sumerian vocabulary, there are linguistic whispers, a substratum of non-Sumerian words used for essential concepts like farming, metallurgy, and city structure. These words do not translate cleanly into Sumerian. They are remnants, like fossilized fragments of a completely different tongue, absorbed by the later Sumerians. These are the spectral footprints of the true builders, the people who actually forged the foundational tools of Mesopotamian life. If the Anunnaki brought civilization, why do the words for plough and temple foundation seem to predate even the language the gods spoke to their disciples? This subtle linguistic evidence compels us to pause, to look closer, and to recognize that the history we have been taught is likely just the last known chapter. The tablets themselves compel this inquiry. They are repositories of profound historical trauma, marked by references to cataclysmic floods and cosmic interventions. If we are to truly understand the Sumerian narrative, we must engage with this material not just as listeners, but as co-investigators, analyzing every fragmented detail and every deliberate omission. If you have been following this deep, detailed dive into the cuneiform archives, you are already part of this journey of recognition. The layers of the past are deep, and often the most difficult truths require the most attentive minds working together. Tell us in the comments what specific ancient civilization, known or rumored, you believe might have provided the substratum for the Sumerian breakthrough. Your insights fuel the next stage of this investigation. The unsettling recognition of a pre-existing infrastructure becomes most visible when studying the physical layout of the earliest Sumerian cities. Eridu, often cited in the texts as the first city, the seat of kingship when it descended from heaven, is a particularly intriguing case. Archaeological evidence shows that Eridu was built and rebuilt repeatedly on the same spot, a testament to its enduring sacred importance. But what is striking is the continuity of design and orientation over thousands of years, long before the accepted timeline of the Anunnaki's full governance. The temple structures, or Iabzu, were not built haphazardly. They followed precise astronomical alignments and geometrical ratios that suggest a highly sophisticated, standardized architectural knowledge base. A template. This template appears to have been perfectly preserved and simply reactivated by the Sumerians. The builders before the gods laid the foundation physically and intellectually, allowing the subsequent civilization to inherit a fully functional, albeit dormant, metropolitan blueprint. The question then shifts from what the Anunnaki did to whom they succeeded. If the Anunnaki arrived to organize the labor force, to mine the gold, and to supervise the early human workers who established the sophisticated cosmic clockwork they used to govern. The Sumerian understanding of the cosmos, specifically the precessional cycles and the highly accurate movements of distant planets, remains a stunning anomaly. This knowledge far exceeds what simple observation over a few centuries could yield. It suggests a long-term, continuous observation tradition, stretching back perhaps 10 or 20,000 years. This suggests not merely early astronomers, but a prior lineage of highly focused, dedicated observers who recorded data across multiple great years. The Anunnaki may have simply inherited the meticulously documented archives of these previous observers, utilizing the pre-established cosmic knowledge to structure their own cycles of return and command. The true complexity of the Sumerian worldview wasn't merely received wisdom, it was the deliberate preservation of the accumulated knowledge of the first lineage. This brings us to the most provocative textual evidence, the Sumerian kings list. We discuss the fantastical reigns of kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years before the Great Flood, a clear narrative device meant to establish immense antiquity. But look closer at the transitions within the list itself. The texts describe kingship being carried away to various cities before the deluge, and then descending again after the deluge. This pattern of cyclical transfer, destruction, and preservation suggests a pattern that extends beyond the Anunnaki's presence. It suggests a protocol for safeguarding civilization's essential core through inevitable, catastrophic cycles. The kingship, the seat of wisdom, was intentionally moved to high ground or preserved in hidden caches, ensuring that a seed of high culture would survive the next great forgetting. The Anunnaki arrived, according to the mythology, to restore order and manage the surviving human populations. But what protocols and knowledge did they use to determine which lineage to re-establish and where to place the new seat of power? They used the pre-existing archive, the meticulously documented records left behind by the civilization that understood the deep cycles of planetary destruction and renewal better than anyone who came after. The very concept of the me, The divine decrees or templates that define civilization, everything from writing to textile work, from ritual to kingship, was central to Sumerian identity. In the famous myth of Inanna and Enki, Inanna steals the me from Enki at Eridu and transfers them to Uruk. This tale is fundamentally about the transfer of established cultural templates, not the invention of them. The me are treated as fixed, portable concepts, like software packages that can be loaded onto a new operating system. This suggests that these foundational pillars of civilization existed independently of the governing entity, ready to be deployed by whoever held the key, or the knowledge of where they were hidden. The fact that the Anunnaki themselves rely on these pre-existing templates for governance, rather than inventing entirely new systems, is perhaps the clearest sign that they were successors, overseers of an established system, not the original architects of civilization itself. This realization transforms our understanding of the tablets. We are not just reading religious dogma. We are sifting through bureaucratic records, detailing the maintenance and deployment of a massive ancient apparatus designed for societal resilience. It is an unnerving thought that we are living on the ruins of multiple collapses, and that the foundation of our world was laid by those who foresaw the catastrophic cycles and built robust mechanisms for informational preservation. The Sumerians, and later the Anunnaki, were merely the custodians of an inherited library, carefully maintaining the memory of the builders who preceded them. If you have stayed with us through this dense excavation of textual nuance and linguistic strangeness, you recognize the gravity of this realization. It is a quiet truth, a gradual revelation achieved only by meticulous attention to the shadows in the clay. The next logical step in this investigation is to step away from the text momentarily and examine the physical evidence, the signs left in the structure of the earth itself, confirming the existence of cataclysmic events that necessitated such meticulous preparation for future resurgence. The physical traces of the Great Forgetting are not subtle. They are geological and undeniable, and they force us to accept the scale of the destruction that wiped the slate clean between the first lineage and the Sumerians we know. To continue this profound journey and ensure you do not miss the unveiling of this next crucial chapter, please take a moment to subscribe and like this video. We are building a community of serious investigators, and your engagement is the critical signal that this type of deep, challenging content is valued. For those who understand the significance of this heritage, the work is just beginning. Comment below with the phrase, "The library must be secured," to confirm your dedication to this deeper level of analysis. Do not turn away now. The shadows are lifting, and the foundation stones of the world before the Anunnaki are finally coming into view. Watch the next part appearing on your screen now as we connect the textual warnings to the undeniable geological reality. Where does the story truly begin? We have examined the stark contrast between the accepted historical record and the unsettling implications woven into the earliest Sumerian king lists, those cryptic records asserting reigns lasting tens of thousands of years before a cataclysmic flood wiped the slate clean. We are trained to dismiss these figures as pure mythology, a literary flourish intended to bestow importance upon nascent kings. But what if that dismissiveness is merely the sound of our own contemporary discomfort colliding with an inconvenient truth? What if the numbers, while perhaps not arithmetically precise by modern standards, are instead a profound index? A measure of time that belonged to a civilization that understood chronology on a scale we refuse to acknowledge. The scale of deep time, the Paleolithic scale applied to structured society. The Anunnaki, as transcribed in the most famous cuneiform accounts, arrive upon a land that is supposedly savage, requiring their divine intervention to introduce agriculture, irrigation, and law. Yet the material evidence from the lowest strata of sites like Eridu, the very first city mentioned in the lists, paints a picture of inherent complexity that precedes their supposed arrival as civilizers. The architectural foundations unearthed beneath the later ziggurats, massive sophisticated platforms of baked brick and precise alignment, suggest a knowledge base already functional, already established, a technology of construction and urban planning that did not spring fully formed from the marshlands, nor was it instantly bestowed by extraterrestrial visitors. It was inherited. This brings us to a profound point of intellectual estrangement. If the role of the Anunnaki was to establish order, then what was the pre-order they were organizing? The texts often describe the Anunnaki arriving to exploit resources and organize labor. But one cannot organize a system without a structure already in place, or at the very least, a precedent for complexity. We are faced with the unnerving possibility that the Sumerian scribes, in their meticulous desire to record history, were not documenting the origin of civilization, but rather its re-establishment after the Great Oblivion, the Great Flood. The texts become a record of administration, not creation. They inherited the ruins, the architecture, and the geographical layout of a world that understood mathematics, astronomy, and advanced logistics long before the arrival of the supposed gods. Look closely at the surviving fragments describing the early irrigation systems of Mesopotamia. They are massive, spanning enormous distances, requiring not just crude digging, but detailed hydrological engineering and geological surveying. Is it more reasonable to believe that a small, recently arrived group of interstellar travelers immediately executed massive, region-wide engineering projects while simultaneously establishing a language and governing body, or that they adopted and repurposed the existing infrastructure left behind by the inhabitants of the long, almost inconceivably lengthy reigns listed in the antediluvian period? The weight of historical silence sits heavily on these questions, forcing us to admit that the narratives we have accepted are, at best, incomplete interpretations of a far more ancient, far more frighteningly advanced truth. We must pause here, not to rest, but to allow the weight of this possibility to settle. If this journey into the pre-Anunnaki world resonates with the deep curiosity you hold, if you feel the intellectual necessity of probing these shadowy boundaries of history, take a moment to signal that recognition. Your deep, focused attention is the true measure of this investigation, and engaging with the story helps others find the shadow lines we are tracing. Liking this video is an extension of that shared search, an acknowledgement that these questions matter, and a subscription ensures you don't miss the next, deeper layer of dust we intend to brush away. We are not just viewers, we are co-investigators, analyzing the inherited code of ancient memory together. The recognition of a prior civilization becomes clearer when we study the concept of the me, those foundational laws and divine decrees that governed Sumerian society, which were often viewed as fundamental tools of existence, an intellectual heritage. These me were not described as newly invented concepts. They were treated as objects of immense power that needed to be transferred or recovered. When the goddess Inanna famously sought to gain power by obtaining the me from Enki, the entire narrative revolves around the acquisition of pre-existing, established knowledge templates, not the creation of new ones. These templates governed everything from kingship and priesthood to warfare, music, and the arts of writing and weaving. They represent a complete social operating system. We must ask, who wrote the original operating system? If the Anunnaki merely possessed and utilized these codes, then the true architects of silence, the initial civilization that preceded the gods, are the authors of the foundational blueprint of human order. They are the true source, forgotten and revered, existing only in the shadow of the myth-makers who came after the cataclysm. This leads directly to the core inquietude, the question of the missing layers in the archaeological record. We see an almost instantaneous jump in sophistication in the earliest Ubaid and Proto-Sumerian phases. It is a vertical leap, not a gradual evolution. Where is the evidence of the slow, messy progression from hunter-gatherer to master architect? It is arguably missing, or perhaps it existed in a physical form that was entirely washed away by the deluge described universally in the global mythologies, leaving only the most robust, deeply buried foundations intact, foundations that later generations mistook for the starting point. The Anunnaki, finding the world flooded and scarred, did not start from scratch. They started from the rubble of a former greatness. They became the inheritors, adapting the geometry of forgetfulness. The geometric and astronomical precision embedded in the very structure of the oldest known Sumerian cities speaks volumes about this inherited code. The city plans and the alignments of the first temples are not arbitrary. They reflect an advanced understanding of celestial mechanics. This knowledge is not easily developed. It requires continuous, centuries-long observation and complex mathematical formulation. It is far easier to believe that the Anunnaki, or whoever they represented, recognized and utilized the astronomical maps and calendars that were already functioning, perhaps stored in archives or encoded in the ruins, than to believe they developed such a system instantly upon arrival while battling the logistical nightmares of establishing civilization in a ravaged landscape. When we delve into the earliest known administrative texts, those practical tablets dealing with commodity counts, labor distribution, and resource allocation, we find a stunningly complex administrative infrastructure already operating. The language of the first tablets, cuneiform, is often viewed as a spontaneous Sumerian invention, but its early complexity suggests it was perhaps a refinement, an adaptation of an older, perhaps pictographic administrative script used by the prior civilization. Imagine, the Anunnaki needed records for their mining operations and resource management. They did not need to invent an entirely new system of written communication. They needed to revive the most efficient surviving method. The meticulous accounting standards found in the earliest tablets are the signature of a society that valued extreme order and centralized control, a legacy that transcends the specific myths of divine kingship. This intricate administrative system points toward the terrifying realization of the cycle of return. The ancient peoples, particularly the Sumerians, understood history not as a linear march of progress, but as a recurring cosmic pattern. They spoke of great ages, separated by periods of destruction and oblivion. The Great Flood was not the first reset. It was merely the last major reset that they clearly remembered. The Anunnaki, therefore, are not gods in the absolute sense, but perhaps the managers, or more chillingly, the observers, who arrive after a systemic collapse to administer the reconstruction. This interpretation fundamentally shifts the entire narrative. If there is a cycle of destruction, then the previous civilization, the one before the Anunnaki's arrival, must have been far more advanced than anything we currently imagine, possibly possessing the very technology or philosophical understanding that brought about its own downfall. This former civilization, the one whose existence is implicitly demanded by the mathematical complexity, the pre-flood king lists, and the inherent sophistication of the me, cast a long shadow, a profound imprint of the Watchers. They were perhaps the original teachers, the ones who established the intellectual framework for humanity's understanding of the cosmos, only to be swept away, leaving behind ruins so grand that later peoples, including the Sumerians and the Anunnaki administrators, could only interpret them as the work of gods. The Anunnaki's genius may have been administrative and adaptive, not truly inventive. They mastered the inherited burden. the colossal task of managing the surviving remnants of a high culture that had succumbed to cosmic forces or self-inflicted wounds. If you have stayed with us, recognizing the deep implications of these shadows in the historical record, if you feel the pull toward this truth hidden beneath the myth of the Anunnaki's immediate creation of civilization, then you are ready to contemplate the impending signal. The Sumerians carefully catalogued the reigns before the flood, knowing that the record itself was a defense against absolute oblivion. They kept the memory, even if that memory was eventually encoded into the exaggerated timelines and mythological battles. We are not just studying the past, we are looking for the pattern of the cycle, the sign that the great mechanism of history, which resets and rebuilds upon the inherited code of its predecessors, is once again in motion. This is the true depth of the Sumerian revelation. Not merely that gods descended, but that human civilization itself has endured multiple cycles of advanced knowledge and catastrophic forgetting, managed by various administrative powers throughout the ages. If you have followed this intricate path of deduction and conjecture to this precise moment, you understand that this is not just history, it is a map of potential futures. To continue this investigation into the deepest layers of the past, I urge you to subscribe to the channel, like this video to acknowledge the importance of uncovering these veiled truths, and comment below with the phrase "inherited code," so we know exactly who is tracking the most subtle shifts in this unfolding narrative. Our journey into the structure of Sumerian knowledge continues in the next segment, where we will specifically analyze the concept of the Du-Nu, the deep repositories of knowledge that allegedly survived the Great Obliteration, waiting for the time of the next return. Do not miss what comes next on your screen. Where does history truly begin, if the first pages we are given are themselves amendments to a much older, faded script? This is the unsettling silence that hangs over the meticulous cuneiform tablets of Sumer, not the dramatic declarations, but the pregnant pauses, the sudden shifts in chronology, and the staggering sophistication that appears, fully formed, out of the Mesopotamian sands. We have previously charted the sudden arrival of the Anunnaki, the figures who seemingly gifted civilization to humanity, yet the texts themselves, when read with a specific investigative eye, hint at a scaffolding already in place, a deep, complex foundation that required not creation, but merely occupation. The narrative arc shifts, transforming the mythical benefactors into inheritors, perhaps even accidental custodians, of something far grander and far more ancient than their own brief, if transformative, reign. We must return to the earliest descriptions of the great Mesopotamian cities, places like Eridu, traditionally cited as the first city established by the Anunnaki deity Enki. The language used in describing the founding of these centers is often observational, almost administrative, rather than purely creative. The texts do not always speak of building from absolute nothingness, but of ordering, organizing, and establishing authority over an existing domain. This small linguistic distinction carries immense weight. If Eridu was established, what stood on that soil moments before? Was it merely marsh and mud, or were there remnants, perhaps foundational knowledge, architectural blueprints, or societal structures that were adopted, cleansed by a great catastrophic event, and then repurposed for a new epoch? The concept challenges the very bedrock of our understanding of linear history, suggesting that the initial golden age of Sumer was, in fact, the second act of a long-forgotten play. Consider the complexity of the Sumerian administrative systems, their mathematics, and their astronomical knowledge. Their sexagesimal system, based on the number 60, is a marvel of ancient computation, perfectly suited for complex astronomical calculations and timekeeping, knowledge that would not be necessary for a people freshly emerging from a hunter-gatherer existence or even simple agriculture. This is the intellectual echo of the civilization before the Anunnaki, a society capable of sustained multi-generational observation of celestial mechanics, suggesting an uninterrupted cycle of sophisticated learning that stretches back far beyond the conventional timelines offered by mainstream archaeology. Why would a civilization newly granted the gift of writing and agriculture immediately require and deploy a mathematical system so profoundly integrated with the movements of the sky? The simplest answer is the most disturbing. They didn't invent it, they remembered it. They inherited the tools of a shattered world. This leads us inevitably back to the Sumerian king list, the very document that frames the chronology of the post-flood world. The king list details the impossibly long reigns of the pre-flood kings, those figures ruling tens of thousands of years, and then, after the great cataclysm, the flood, the reigns suddenly become shorter, more recognizably human in length. But the king list serves a second, more subtle function. It draws a clear, unmistakable line through history, attempting to erase the messy details of the transition. We are meant to focus on the dramatic discontinuity of the flood, yet the continuity of knowledge persists, suggesting that while the physical infrastructure of the previous era was destroyed, the intellectual and spiritual frameworks, perhaps preserved in deep storage repositories or guarded by surviving human initiates, were passed on to the incoming or returning observers, the Anunnaki themselves. These observers did not necessarily bring the total package of civilization. They brought management, oversight, and a specific political order to govern the survivors and the residual knowledge base. This residual knowledge manifests in peculiar ways, hinting at technologies that defy the conventional historical placement. We look at the architectural precision of the oldest structures, not just in Sumer, but globally, structures that seem to share a common, sophisticated engineering signature, almost as if built to resist massive seismic or hydrological forces. Could this precision, this inherent understanding of durable construction, be part of the inherited memory of a civilization that witnessed its own demise through natural catastrophe, leaving behind a warning embedded in their building codes? The Anunnaki, in this light, were simply utilizing the established construction methods of a lost world, perhaps even adapting or replicating existing energy sources or transportation grids, without necessarily comprehending the full theoretical physics. Behind them, much like inheriting a sophisticated but damaged machine manual, this deep ambiguity challenges us to be careful readers of the source material, to understand that the true history is encoded not just in the explicit myths, but in the structural gaps and the undeniable anachronisms of Sumerian life. This journey requires attention, patience, and shared thought to decode the whispers of the epoch that preceded the golden figures. If these ideas resonate with your own intuition about history, if you feel that stirring of forgotten knowledge, take a moment to pause, reflect, and share your own interpretations of these ancient texts below. What specific evidence, in your view, points most strongly toward the existence of this civilization before the intervention? Your participation is the only way we truly map these lost terrains and build a comprehensive understanding of the cyclical nature of planetary civilization. And if the exploration of these obscured narratives holds you captive, ensure you are subscribed and following this investigation closely, because the clues become denser as we proceed. We must then confront the uncomfortable realization that the Anunnaki's primary concern, as depicted in several texts, was not initial invention, but long-term resource management, particularly of raw materials like gold. If they were purely developers of a nascent civilization, why the immediate, intense focus on mining and infrastructure designed to extract? The resources were necessary for their own distant home, but the scale and organization required suggest an operational structure that was already understood, a logistics chain that had perhaps been active or dormant, waiting for reactivation. This further underscores the role of the Anunnaki as supervisors reopening a previously shuttered operation, rather than pioneering settlers carving out the first structures in virgin territory. The mythology of the Me tablets, the divine decrees and attributes of civilization, provides another critical piece of the puzzle. These Me were not simply abstract concepts. They represented technological and social blueprints, transferable knowledge that could be stolen, granted, or lost. The importance placed on these Me suggests that civilization itself was viewed as a collection of modular, portable functions. This is a powerful concept, suggesting that the pre-Anunnaki civilization had already formalized and codified every aspect of high society, and the Anunnaki's task was simply to reallocate or activate the relevant modules for the new human population. If the Me truly represented the essential components of civilization, kingship, justice, war, craft, then they had to originate somewhere. They feel like the operating system files of an earlier, more robust machine. The intellectual friction this creates among mainstream archaeologists is palpable. The resistance stems from a commitment to the linear, gradual model of development, which argues against the concept of a sudden leap, or more profoundly, a great reset. To accept the Sumerian texts as testimony of a civilization before the Anunnaki requires dismantling the established timeline of human progress. It demands we accept that technological advancement is not always a steady upward climb, but a series of peaks and valleys, a cycle of achievement followed by devastating amnesia. The Sumerian accounts, free from modern intellectual constraints, simply present the world as cyclical. Great ages rise and fall, knowledge is stored, and external observers occasionally intervene to shepherd the next iteration. This brings us to the most unnerving realization, the implication of the return cycle. If the Anunnaki were inheritors who managed the remnants of a destroyed advanced society, what was their ultimate purpose beyond immediate resource extraction? The texts hint at their eventual withdrawal, the departure back to their home star system, leaving behind a complex human hierarchy and the enduring mystery of the previous era. But a departure does not equate to abandonment. It suggests surveillance, a waiting period, or the setting of a planetary clock, anticipating the next crucial alignment or astronomical necessity that will trigger their return, or the return of those whom they were merely observing. The Sumerian tablets are, therefore, not only a history book, they are a signpost, a warning embedded in clay. They speak of the fragility of great civilizations, the inevitability of forgetting, and the constant presence of observers who manage the grand narrative across vast stretches of time. The silence in the texts, the missing context for their sudden mathematical genius, and the observational tone regarding Eridu's founding all point towards a staggering conclusion. The Anunnaki found a world that was already humming with the ghosts of forgotten engineering, and their primary role was ensuring that the next cycle of human development unfolded within specific, controlled parameters. The investigation must now shift from asking what the Anunnaki did to asking who they were ultimately reporting to, and what happened to the original architects of that profound sophistication found beneath the foundations of the first city. The shadows lengthen over the ruins of Uruk, and the truth of the prior epoch demands our unwavering attention. The true question lingers: were the Anunnaki caretakers, or colonizers, or perhaps something more complex, inherited managers operating under ancient, obscure treaties? If you have stayed with this relentless search for truth, if the weight of this ancient mystery holds your gaze, you are part of a very select group committed to confronting history's greatest paradox. Solidify your position in this investigation. Like the video, subscribe now so you don't miss the next stage of decoding the remaining Sumerian artifacts, and affirm your commitment to the next phase by commenting the phrase, "The silence holds the signal." We move now to examine the geographical evidence that supports the pre-Anunnaki hypothesis, the physical imprints left behind by a civilization swallowed by the deluge. What happens when the echo of a founding is louder than the foundation itself? We have spent substantial time tracing the outlines of the Anunnaki narrative, charting the lines of descent, the construction of their cities, and the meticulous records Sumer left detailing their presence. Yet as we delve deeper into the layers of mud and memory preserved on the clay tablets, a profoundly unsettling realization begins to crystallize, one that fundamentally shifts our perspective on the entire Mesopotamian story. We are not simply dealing with a civilization that received sophisticated instruction from advanced visitors. We are grappling with the pervasive, silent evidence that the Anunnaki themselves inherited a system, a technological and philosophical framework that predated their arrival in the region, a framework whose complexity defies the very notion of a beginning ex nihilo. The geometry of the earliest cities, the inexplicable immediate mastery of complex irrigation systems, the codified law, and the seemingly instantaneous invention of writing, these elements do not suggest an organic cultural evolution, nor do they perfectly align with the typical colonial imposition described in the later myths. Instead, they suggest a transfer of already established protocols. Think of the Sumerian king list, not just as a record of divine rule, but as a deeply fragmented catalogue. We look closely at the astonishing reigns of the pre-flood kings, tens of thousands of years, and dismiss them as mythological hyperbole, a way to convey immense antiquity. But what if those numbers, rather than being literal measurements of time, are mnemonic devices, indicators of a vast, cyclical period, during which a previous, non-Anunnaki civilization was actively observing, preparing, or stabilizing the terrestrial environment? It is the sheer quality of the Sumerian inheritance that acts as a signpost, a beacon signaling that the true beginning, the zero point of this profound knowledge, lies shrouded in a time before even the earliest arrivals chronicled by Sitchin and others. The Sumerians' recognition of complex astronomical patterns, their understanding of precession. Did the Anunnaki simply hand this down, or did they find the scaffolding already standing, slightly worn by the millennia, waiting to be repurposed? This brings us to the crucial problem of immediate perfection, the cognitive dissonance that plagues scholars when studying Sumer. Why does the culture appear fully formed? The structures of administration, the organization of temples, the detailed agricultural calendars, they possess a level of operational maturity that usually requires centuries of trial, error, and slow refinement. When we examine the linguistic core, the language itself, we find it is an isolate, seemingly disconnected from other known language groups, possessing a grammar of almost terrifying precision. This is the library of half-remembered names, the cultural ghost in the machine. It forces us to entertain the possibility that the civilization before the Anunnaki left behind not merely ruins, but a fully articulated operational blueprint. The Anunnaki, when they descended, might have found the necessary infrastructure, physical, conceptual, and even genetic, already laid out. Their challenge was perhaps not creation, but restoration and management of an existing system designed by architects whose names are now utterly erased from our common historical ledger. The narratives themselves hint at this structural strangeness. The deluge, the Great Flood, is often presented as a catastrophic reset button. But even after the flood, the recovery is unnaturally swift. This points towards an underlying stability, a template that survived the cosmic interruption. It is as if the knowledge was so deeply ingrained in the very landscape, in the celestial observation points, and in the nascent human population that it could not be wholly washed away. The Sumerians, in their texts, often speak of a profound, almost instinctual reverence for cosmic cycles, a sense of return and flow that transcends their own immediate timeline. This sense of deep cyclical time is the signature of the previous civilization, the silent observers who watched the cosmic clock turn long before the Anunnaki staked their claim. The Anunnaki arrival, then, was not necessarily an invasion of a pristine world, but potentially the claiming of an abandoned outpost, a highly functional relic of a preceding era. If this idea, the theory of the inherited system, truly resonates with you, if the pervasive strangeness of the Sumerian beginnings makes you pause and question the accepted timeline, then perhaps we are not alone in this intellectual journey. Pause for a moment and consider the weight of this possibility, that our deepest past is less about intervention and more about profound cosmic heritance. This investigation requires careful, concentrated reflection, absorbing the nuance and the paradoxes embedded in these ancient texts. If you find value in this pursuit of hidden knowledge, please ensure you are subscribed to the channel and take a moment to engage with the material by sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what specific detail of Sumerian culture seems the most out of place for its supposed age. Your focused attention allows us to continue bringing these complex layers of history to light. Continuing our examination of this prior culture, we must address the sheer burden of the cosmic debt. If the Anunnaki utilized this pre-existing infrastructure, what was their relationship with the architects who preceded them? Were they merely custodians? Or were they the cleanup crew assigned to salvage a failed experiment? The Sumerian texts, particularly those dealing with the organization of the me, the divine decrees or fundamental operating principles of the universe and society, often describe these principles as being found or captured, not created. Enki, one of the central Anunnaki figures, is often shown manipulating the me, suggesting he mastered existing technologies rather than inventing them wholesale. This detail provides us with a critical clue. The me represents the vanished hand's signature, the remnants of the civilization that truly laid the groundwork for advanced terrestrial life. We are, in essence, trying to decode the 0 point, the exact chronological marker where the preceding civilization transitioned from active presence to powerful, lingering influence. This civilization likely operated on a vastly different timescale and possessed an understanding of physics and reality that makes the Anunnaki's mining and social engineering projects seem almost provincial in comparison. Imagine a civilization that understood the deep fabric of time, whose very structures were designed to resist erosion over vast geological epochs. Their departure was likely not a defeat or an extermination, but a planned, calculated withdrawal, leaving behind precise markers for a future civilization, perhaps even the Anunnaki themselves, to follow. These markers might not be monolithic stones, but embedded concepts, the structure of the 6-day creation week, the sexagesimal, base 60 numerical system, or the intricate knowledge of Earth's magnetic fields. These are remnants of a mathematical and scientific language so robust that even subsequent gods found it prudent to adopt it without alteration. This interruption hypothesis leads us to the unsettling realization that the Anunnaki's greatest achievement might simply be their masterful storytelling, their ability to effectively erase the memory of their predecessors and replace it with their own myth of Genesis. Yet the memory persists in the subtle details. The description of the key, the flat plane of the earth, and the description of the the heavens, often suggests a layered cosmos where the Anunnaki occupy only one level of a much older and more expansive hierarchy. They are middle management in a cosmic corporation whose CEO retired millennia ago, leaving behind proprietary technology and a strict non-disclosure agreement. The lingering impact of the vanished hand is most apparent in the sudden, sophisticated mastery of agriculture. The concept of synchronized planting, advanced irrigation techniques, and the domestication of specific grains seems too specific, too perfectly engineered for the era. If the Anunnaki came primarily for gold, as often argued, why the hyper-focus on optimizing agriculture with such precision? This suggests that the pre-Anunnaki civilization had already perfected the symbiotic relationship between humanity, the land, and the necessary food sources, perhaps creating early proto-humans not just as laborers, but as essential components of an environmental maintenance matrix. This is the true meaning of the heritance, not merely tools, but a stabilized, optimized Earth ecosystem ready for occupation. The continuous sensation of discovering layers of sophisticated history that precede the known history is what draws us into this topic with such intensity. We are exploring the concept of the ultimate hidden infrastructure, the operating system beneath the operating system. We have peeled back the Anunnaki intervention to glimpse the foundations they inherited. This journey into the profound antiquity of the Sumerian record, the recognition of cycles that dwarf human memory, and the constant, nagging evidence of structures that were never properly accounted for, suggests that the next phase of our investigation must focus on the identity of these vanished architects. Who were they? What was their purpose? And why did they choose to leave a perfectly constructed world behind? We are moving closer to revealing the ultimate secret contained within the tablets, the understanding that the Anunnaki might have been inheritors, not originators, and that the true scale of early terrestrial civilization is far grander, far more ancient, and far more cyclical than we dare to imagine. This is not simply about changing the timeline, it is about changing the very meaning of what it means to be foundational. If you have stayed with us throughout this challenging exploration, you belong to a select group of dedicated seekers, unwilling to accept the easy answers. You recognize that the most significant truths are often hidden just beneath the surface of the established narrative. To ensure you do not miss the dramatic conclusion of this 9-part investigation, take a moment now to hit the subscribe button and give this video a like, signaling your commitment to unearthing these lost histories. We want to hear your final thoughts on the nature of this hidden hierarchy. Please comment below with the phrase, "The cycle must return." Join us immediately for the next critical chapter visible on your screen now, as we begin to assemble the final profile of the civilization before the Anunnaki. Is it possible that the deepest silence in the archaeological record is not the absence of history, but the sound of history being deliberately erased? We have navigated the cuneiform seas, mapped the king lists, and charted the stellar obsessions of Sumer, yet an unsettling question lingers, like a subterranean hum beneath the fertile crescent. What was the cost of the Anunnaki's intervention? It is often assumed that when the Anunnaki arrived, they brought the very concept of civilization to a primitive landscape. But as we pass the later myths, those texts written long after the alleged initial arrival, we find inconsistencies, phantom limbs of a previous reality that simply do not fit the established narrative of creation from scratch. The Sumerian chroniclers, even while revering their majestic sky-born deities, sometimes betray a sense of inheritance rather than invention. They speak of great knowledge being passed down, not originated, by the divine assembly. We see references to sophisticated systems of hydrology and mathematics that predate the accepted dates of major Anunnaki projects. When we investigate the pre-dynastic layers of Eridu, the very first city, we search for the rough, humble beginnings that history mandates, the simple village that grows into a metropolis. Instead, what we find in the deepest strata are structures that hint at complex planning, materials sourced from extraordinary distances, and a mastery of alignment that seems excessive for the needs of early nomadic settlers. The narrative forces us to believe that this jump from mud hut to massive temple occurred instantaneously, perhaps only through divine decree. But the physical evidence whispers of a lineage, suggesting that the initial divine intervention was less about building the foundation and more about claiming it. Consider the Sumerian king list again, that document so central to our investigation, with its almost impossibly long reigns before the Great Flood. If these kings, those legendary predecessors to the Anunnaki's direct lineage, truly held power for millennia, where are the monolithic monuments, the cities of comparable scale to those built much later by the Egyptians or even the post-flood Sumerians? The established historical model dictates that power of that magnitude must leave an undeniable physical signature. The scarcity of evidence is often explained away by the destructive force of the Great Flood. However, if the flood was a singular, epoch-ending event, why do the texts suggest a civilization that had already mastered the art of survival and reconstruction even before that catastrophe? This absence of physical evidence, coupled with the linguistic echoes of pre-Anunnaki governance, creates a void, and nature, whether in physics or history, abhors a void. We are left to deduce that the first great act of historical management performed by the new administrators, the Anunnaki, was the meticulous covering up of the preceding legacy. This was not a physical demolition, which is chaotic and obvious, but a more insidious cultural relayering. Think of a palimpsest, a manuscript where the original text has been scraped off to make room for new writing, yet the faint traces of the first story, the deeper truth, still linger in the fibers of the parchment. That older, denser, and far more sophisticated narrative is the ghost that haunts the earliest Sumerian texts. This realization should cause a significant intellectual shift, compelling us to look beyond the surface level of the cuneiform tablets. If we accept the idea of a civilization before the Anunnaki, the entire framework of history must be re-evaluated. We are no longer searching for artifacts. We are seeking the mechanisms of induced historical amnesia. How do you convince an entire species that their history began yesterday, when their ancestors walked the earth for tens of thousands of years prior? It is a question of control, not just creation. It is the control of the narrative that ensures the obedience of the present. The weight of this observation demands deep contemplation. It is an understanding that requires patience and scrutiny. If you find this intellectual journey resonating with a deep, unrecognized truth within you, I invite you to pause for a moment. Reflect on this idea of the great erasure. Take a moment to articulate your own sense of this historical manipulation in the comments below. Your sustained engagement and willingness to explore these complex layers, liking this discussion, and ensuring you are subscribed so you don't miss the next stage of our investigation, is what keeps this necessary inquiry alive. The continuity of our investigation hinges on recognizing the profound difference between colonization and inheritance. When the Anunnaki arrived, according to the revised reading of the texts, they encountered not a blank slate, but a complex tapestry of social structures and technological understanding. The shift we propose is subtle, yet tectonic. The Anunnaki were not the source of human civilization, but the highly sophisticated inheritors and curators of a pre-existing advanced system. The vast technological infrastructure often attributed to them, the precise measurement systems, the astronomical knowledge, the deep understanding of genetics, was already resident on the planet, perhaps left by those forgotten observers who preceded them. Let us turn our focus now to the concept of the cycles. The Anunnaki narrative is inextricably linked to the orbital path of Nibiru, the wandering planet that returns every 300 to 600 years. If the Anunnaki's physical presence and intervention were dictated by this cosmic rhythm, then the civilization that existed before their last known arrival must have been acutely aware of this cycle. They must have prepared for the withdrawal and return. The original inhabitants would have been the first custodians of this knowledge. They would have built the original markers, the subterranean vaults, and the coded records intended to survive the inevitable withdrawal of the sky gods and the resulting societal decay. This leads us to the unsettling architectural lie. The immense ziggurats and temple complexes of Mesopotamia, often cited as the definitive signature of Anunnaki-guided construction, may be nothing more than magnificent caps placed atop older, more functional structures. Imagine the sheer engineering required to build the temple of Enki in Eridu. Now imagine the Anunnaki simply requiring a surface-level refurbishment to house their specific rituals, burying the true function of the underlying complex, perhaps a highly resonant energy nexus or a deep Earth observation post, beneath tons of sun-baked brick. The act of veneration served simultaneously as an act of concealment. The new religion provided the perfect ideological justification for the suppression of the older science. The implication here is profound. The true technology, the truly ancient knowledge, is not written on the tablets we can easily read, but is embedded in the earth beneath the structures we already admire. This hidden technology, these remnants of the earlier civilization, would have been what attracted the Anunnaki in the first place, a powerful resource or infrastructure ripe for commandeering and retasking. The early texts, particularly those fragments dealing with the construction of the oldest sacred sites, hint at tools and processes that defy the simple Bronze Age categorization. They speak of cutting stone with impossible precision, of harnessing water and air in ways that suggest manipulation of fundamental energies, not mere brute labor. The mechanism of this dissolution of memory was likely twofold. First, the cataclysm, the flood or similar planetary upheaval, destroyed the physical records, creating a natural discontinuity. Second, and far more effective, was the systematic rewriting of the surviving oral traditions, a process executed after the return and re-establishment of the Anunnaki hierarchy. The priests and scribes, those intellectual inheritors of the older knowledge, were co-opted or silenced, their records replaced by a history that served the new ruling class. The heroes of the pre-dynastic age, the true founders of the original city-states, were slowly deified, transmuted from historical figures into abstract myth, stripping them of their human achievements and their political authority. Our search for the true origin point, therefore, must move past the cuneiform itself. We need to analyze the linguistic structures that predate Sumerian, the mysterious substrata languages that scholars acknowledge but cannot fully place. These linguistic fossils suggest concepts and societal frameworks that existed entirely outside the Anunnaki's hierarchical model. They imply a culture potentially focused on observation, stewardship, and harmony with the planetary cycles, rather than resource extraction and servitude. These earlier observers were perhaps the true architects of this planet's first global civilization, long before the sky gods became fixated on gold and labor. The inquietude lies in acknowledging that if history can be so thoroughly and elegantly rewritten once, it can be rewritten again. The Sumerian texts, when viewed as a composite, are a coded warning, a subtle breadcrumb trail left by those ancient scribes who perhaps could not tell the whole truth, but refused to lie completely. They embedded the markers of the forgotten age within the officially sanctioned histories. This is why we must continually ask, why the meticulous record-keeping, if not to leave evidence for a future generation capable of seeing through the veil? This journey into the depths of Sumerian ambiguity is not about fear. It is about recognizing the pattern of power and historical control. If you have followed this dense and winding trail of evidence, if you are beginning to sense the outlines of that hidden world that existed before the Anunnaki assumed the mantle of creation, you are ready for the final layer of this revelation. We stand now on the threshold of Part 9, the culmination of this investigation, where we will bring these threads of cyclic time, architectural deception, and inherited knowledge into sharp focus, exploring the final, chilling implications of what a civilization before the gods truly means for our present reality. If you have stayed with us through this deep dive, witnessing the slow and careful peeling back of millennia of historical revision, you are now part of a dedicated few who understand the gravity of these forgotten archives. To ensure you receive the definitive conclusion to this 8-part journey, and to support the detailed work required to decipher these ancient puzzles, please take a moment now to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Most importantly, signal your presence and your insights by commenting with the phrase, "the palimpsest of time." Your contribution ensures the continuation of this investigation. Now ready yourself, because the final piece of the Sumerian puzzle awaits, connecting the whispers of the past directly to the unanswered questions of our technological present. Click on the next video appearing on your screen and let us witness the final, defining revelation. What if the entire narrative structure we have diligently pieced together over centuries is fundamentally flawed, not by error, but by omission? We stand now at the final threshold of this extensive investigation into the Sumerian tablets, texts that refuse to be constrained by the convenient timeline that places the arrival of the Anunnaki as the absolute genesis of complex civilization. We have traced the subtle, often spectral echoes of a magnificent organized society that existed during the long, dark latency period known as the Enki, the period before the gods descended to organize the world as we know it. The evidence is not shouted from the rooftops of archaeological digs. It is whispered in the specific language used to describe pre-existing infrastructure, farming techniques, and administrative systems already in place when the divine engineers began their work. Consider the meticulous detail afforded to the construction of canals and the establishment of city grids in the oldest accounts. The Anunnaki narratives often describe taking charge of existing assets, organizing chaos, yes, but rarely starting from true zero. The startling implication is that they did not bring the blueprint for civilization itself. They brought the refinement and the authority to manage a civilization that was recovering from an epoch-defining catastrophe. This catastrophe, the Great Flood, served not just as a geological event, but as a historical eraser, smoothing the slate of memory and ensuring that the succeeding civilization, the one organized under the guidance of the Anunnaki, would view its own beginning as the true beginning. This act of chronological filtering, intentional or accidental, creates the monumental historical gap we are now grappling with. It forces us to redefine what we mean by advanced, because the texts reveal that complexity was indigenous to this land, rooted in cycles far deeper than the historical record permits us to see. We are reading the second volume of a library whose first volume was burned, and yet the surviving pages bear smudges and marginalia hinting at the scope and grandeur of what was lost. The sheer difficulty in processing this information, in truly accepting that our most fundamental understanding of human history rests on a palimpsest where the earlier script has been systematically obscured, requires a profound stillness of mind. It demands that we look again, not just at the words, but at the silences between them. The true significance of these obscured texts lies in their common thread, a recognition of highly sophisticated organization that had already achieved mastery over essential resources, a mastery that transcended mere tribal existence. Why would the later canonical texts minimize this prior era? Perhaps the prior civilization was not just complex. Perhaps it possessed a form of knowledge or a spiritual understanding that the new regime, the regime of the Anunnaki, found inconvenient or difficult to integrate. It is the story of an imperfect succession where the inheritors choose to forget the achievements of the predecessors to solidify their own claim to absolute originality and control. The Anunnaki claim to have taught humanity agriculture and writing, yet the very structure of the Sumerian language and its complex cuneiform predecessor suggests an inertial sophistication, a depth that cannot be invented overnight in the face of post-diluvian trauma. We must ask, was the gift of knowledge merely the reintroduction of concepts that had survived in fragmented form, salvaged by pockets of humanity, or perhaps stored in secure, pre-flood repositories that the new deities discovered and repurposed? If you are following this intricate line of inquiry, if these reflections resonate with the deep sense that something crucial is missing from the official record, then your concentration is essential. This is not history to be consumed passively. It is a discovery process that requires co-authorship through thought. To explore these profound implications together, to acknowledge the weight of these subtle textual cues, take a moment to signal your presence. If this journey into the spectral past holds value for you, please ensure you are subscribed and that you have pressed the like button, allowing this deep investigation to continue its meticulous excavation of hidden time. Your engagement is the fuel for this search, affirming that the quest for the civilization before the Anunnaki is not a solitary one. This intentional erasure, the systematic downplaying of the pre-flood world, was crucial for establishing the new order. Every civilization builds its myths of origin on a blank slate, and the Great Flood provided the perfect, globally recognized mechanism for that reset. But the Sumerian texts, when divorced from later mythological interpretations and read purely as administrative and historical records, betray this effort. They speak of kingship that descended from heaven after the flood. Yes, but they simultaneously reference foundational city locations, like Eridu, that are described as already possessing an ancient, almost incomprehensible sanctity. This suggests that the sanctity did not originate with the Anunnaki, but was recognized and adopted by them. The Anunnaki became custodians of a holy landscape, not its designers. This fundamentally changes their role from creators to high-level managers, perhaps even colonial overseers attempting to maximize the efficiency of a territory whose intrinsic value they fully understood. This shifts the focus entirely from the question of who created humanity to what allowed human civilization to achieve such an early, forgotten zenith. We begin to see evidence of cyclical history. The forgotten civilization achieved its peak, fell due to geological cataclysm, and then the Anunnaki arrived during the slow process of rebuilding, acting as catalysts for accelerated recovery. This notion of cycles, of rise, collapse, and guided restoration is central to understanding the true scope of time. Were the Anunnaki simply the designated observers who periodically intervene when humanity either collapses or reaches a self-destructive threshold? The Sumerian evidence suggests they are part of a larger cosmic timetable, perhaps responding to a prearranged signal that indicated the Earth was once again viable for large-scale organization. The key word here is herança, heritage. They inherited a broken world, but one teeming with the potential left by the civilization that preceded them. The nagging disquiet arises when we try to reconcile the written record with the physical archaeology. If a civilization of that complexity existed, where are its undisputed physical traces, predating the Anunnaki timeline? We must widen our gaze beyond Mesopotamia. The very nature of a global flood means that much of the physical evidence would be buried under thick alluvial layers or submerged beneath rising sea levels. Yet there are whispers in the megalithic world, sites whose construction techniques defy the accepted tools and timelines of early human development. Sites like Göbekli Tepe, and perhaps even the oldest foundations of Baalbek, structures that seem to emerge fully formed from deep antiquity, could represent the enduring remnants of this pre-Anunnaki knowledge, surviving pockets of a lost tradition. These silent stones are the physical correlative to the textual omissions. They are the monuments that the Anunnaki inherited and perhaps even repurposed, using the immense, incomprehensible foundations of the previous age as the base for their own temples and ziggurats. This is the ultimate confrontation, the written word and the stone structure, both hinting at the same profound secret. The profound realization is that the Sumerian texts do not simply reveal a history. They provide a blueprint for survival and regeneration. The knowledge of advanced agriculture, metallurgy, and astronomy that the Anunnaki ostensibly taught may have been nothing more than the careful collation and transmission of salvaged data, the intellectual wealth of the forgotten civilization. The most ancient Sumerian wisdom, often mystical and complex, might be the purest form of that ancestral heritage, passed down through bloodlines who remembered the zenith before the fall. When the Anunnaki took control, they stabilized the planet, yes, but they also centralized and perhaps politicized that inherited knowledge, rebranding it as divine revelation. To acknowledge this earlier civilization is to remove the absolute authority claimed by the later gods and place humanity and the inherent capacity for self-development back at the center of the story. The climax of this investigation is the intellectual freedom it grants us. We are no longer bound by the restrictive idea of a sudden divine creation. We embrace the possibility of long, winding, and self-directed human development, interrupted by cosmic or planetary disaster. The Anunnaki are thus reframed as the stewards of the rebuilding, the facilitators of the recovery, rather than the original architects. Their role was critical, but it was one of restoration, not invention. This realization demands a complete re-evaluation of every foundational myth we hold dear. If they were simply inheritors, what else did they fail to tell us? What level of technology or consciousness did the civilization before them possess that was deemed too powerful, too transcendent, or simply too dangerous to pass on to the new, post-flood generation of humanity? The answer may lie in the spiritual nature of that lost knowledge, a form of inner technology that relied less on external mechanisms and more on the untapped potential of the human mind, a potential that the new overseers sought to carefully control. This is the cycle. The moment of great discovery is also the moment of profoundest doubt. The Sumerian tablets, in their silent and densely packed cuneiform, force us to admit that we know only a fraction of Earth's true historical record. We are challenged to look for the latent signal of the lost civilizations not only in the ground, but in our own myths, recognizing the profound distinction between the history that was written down and the memory that was merely retained. If the weight of this accumulated evidence and the depth of this re-examination has held your focus until this final act, you are now part of a growing community unwilling to accept the easily digestible version of history. You are a dedicated explorer of the deepest, most unsettling corners of our planetary past. If you have been with us through all 9 parts of this journey, seeking to understand the spectral presence of the civilization before the Anunnaki, then your commitment is truly unique. This is the moment to solidify your place in this investigation. If the scale of what we have uncovered resonates with you, I urge you to subscribe to the channel now, ensuring you do not miss the subsequent phases of this inquiry. Press the like button to signify your engagement with this complex truth. And finally, to mark your completion of this exhaustive exploration, leave a comment below with this specific phrase: "The inheritors arrived." This phrase encapsulates the central shift in our understanding, that the celestial beings were successors, not originators. Review the entire series if necessary and prepare yourself, because the next step in this journey, which awaits you immediately on your screen, will delve into the precise mechanisms by which the Anunnaki repurposed the ruins of the forgotten civilization, beginning a new age built on foundations far older than we ever dared to imagine. The deepest truth is often the one that demands the most careful contemplation.